The stagecoach rattled to a stop with a squeal of worn brakes and a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured the small, unremarkable town of Cottonwood Springs. Tessa O'Malley gripped her worn leather satchel tighter, her knuckles white as the coach settled. April 1876 had brought nothing but uncertainty since she'd left Boston 3 weeks ago. And now, as she prepared to disembark, she wondered if she'd made the most terrible mistake of her young life. The journey west had drained nearly all her resources. 22 years old and entirely alone, she had sold virtually everything she owned to purchase the deed to a small property near this frontier town site unseen. Based solely on an advertisement in the Boston Chronicle and desperate letters, exchanged with a land agent who had abruptly stopped corresponding 3 weeks ago. "Last stop, Cottonwood Springs," the driver called, his voice gruff from years of shouting over the rumble of coach wheels and the pounding of hooves. Tessa was the last passenger. The others, a cattle buyer, a whiskey salesman, and an elderly couple, had disembarked at larger towns along the route. She smoothed her travel-worn blue dress, adjusted her small hat, and descended carefully from the coach. Her boots touched Arizona Territory soil for the first time, sending a small puff of dust into the warm afternoon air. The driver unceremoniously dropped her trunk beside her and tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, madam," he said, before climbing back onto his perch and snapping the reins. The stagecoach pulled away, leaving Tessa standing alone on the dusty main street of Cottonwood Springs. She had expected to be met by Mr. Jenkins, the land agent who had arranged the sale of her small ranch. His last letter had promised he would arrange for her transportation to the property upon her arrival. But the street was largely empty, save for a few townspeople going about their business, none of whom spared her more than a curious glance. The setting sun cast long shadows across the town's weathered buildings. A saloon, a general store, a small church, and what appeared to be a sheriff's office lined the main street. Tessa felt a flutter of panic. Night was falling, she had no transportation to her property, and she had no idea where to find lodging in this unfamiliar town. As she stood uncertainly beside her trunk, a tall figure emerged from the shadow of the general store. A man moved toward her with the easy, measured stride of someone perfectly at home in this harsh landscape. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust, and his face was partially obscured by the brim of his worn Stetson. When he was a few paces away, he stopped. Tessa could see him clearly now, broad-shouldered in a faded blue shirt, a leather vest worn smooth by years of use, and denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. His face was tanned and weathered by the sun, with lines at the corners of eyes that were a startling shade of green. A well-trimmed mustache curved above lips pressed into a thoughtful line as he studied her. He couldn't have been more than 30, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of a man who had seen more than his share of hardship. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with hints of auburn, and inclined his head politely. "You must be Miss O'Malley," he said, his voice deep and quiet, carrying a slight drawl. "I reckon you're wondering where Jenkins is." Tessa straightened her spine. "Yes, I am, and you are." "Owen Xavier," he replied, placing his hat back on his head before tipping it slightly. "Welcome home." His words caught her off guard. Home. This dusty, foreign place was supposed to be her home now. The weight of her decision suddenly felt overwhelming. "I don't understand," Tessa said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Jenkins was to meet me. I have the deed to a property. Jenkins left town about 2 weeks back," Owen interrupted, his expression grim. "Seems he was running schemes on folks back east, selling the same properties to multiple buyers. Sheriff ran him out after the telegraph operator started getting complaints." Tessa felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "That my property, the deed you have, is likely worthless," Owen confirmed, though his tone was gentle. "Jenkins didn't own most of the land he was selling. I'm sorry, madam." Tessa's legs threatened to give way beneath her. Everything her inheritance from her parents, The money from selling their modest home after their deaths from influenza last winter, all of it gone. She had nothing left in Boston to return to, and now it seemed she had nothing here either. "I see," she managed, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Is there a hotel where I might stay while I decide what to do next?" Owen shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Finch runs a boarding house, but she's full up with railroad surveyors right now." He hesitated, then added, "The property Jenkins sold you, I know which one it is. It's adjacent to my ranch. The previous owner, old Tom Sullivan, passed last year. His cabin's still standing, though it needs work." "You're saying the property exists, but Mr. Jenkins didn't own it to sell," Tessa clarified, struggling to understand. "That's right. The county's been trying to sort out who the rightful heir might be, but Sullivan was a loner, no family that anyone knows of." Owen paused. "Look, it'll be dark soon. I can take you out to the Sullivan place. At least you'll have a roof over your head tonight while you figure things out." Tessa hesitated. Going alone with a stranger to an isolated cabin wasn't what proper Boston ladies did. But she was no longer in Boston, and her options were severely limited. "Why would you help me, Mr. Xavier?" she asked directly. Something like respect flickered in his eyes at her forthright question. "We look after our own out here, Miss O'Malley. Besides, I've had my fill of seeing Jenkins' victims stranded." He gestured toward a wagon tied up outside the general store. "I'm heading back to my ranch anyway. It's no trouble to drop you at Sullivan's place." Tessa considered her options, which were painfully few. "Very well, Mr. Xavier. I accept your offer." Owen nodded and moved to lift her trunk, placing it effortlessly into the back of his wagon. He offered his hand to help her climb onto the seat, his calloused palm rough against her gloved fingers. As they pulled away from town, Tessa sat rigidly beside him, her posture perfect despite her exhaustion. The landscape opened up before them, vast, rugged, and painted in shades of gold and amber by the setting sun. So different from the crowded, noisy streets of Boston. "It's a good piece of land," Owen said after they had traveled in silence for several minutes. "Good water from a year-round creek, decent grazing, and the cabin's solid though basic. You know it well. Sullivan was a friend. I helped him when I could, especially in his last years." Owen's hands were steady on the reins. "If you're wondering why I didn't buy it myself when he passed, I would have, but I've been expanding north and my funds were tied up." Tessa looked out at the passing landscape, trying to imagine making a life here. "What does one do with a small ranch in Arizona territory? I'm afraid my knowledge of ranching is non-existent." Owen glanced at her, surprise evident on his face. "You bought a ranch without knowing the first thing about ranching." Tessa felt her cheeks flush. "The advertisement described it as a charming country property with agricultural potential. I thought perhaps I might grow vegetables or keep chickens. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Xavier." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she'd seen. "I don't doubt that, Miss O'Malley. But ranching is more than hard work, it's a particular kind of knowledge." "Then I shall have to learn," she said firmly, though inside she felt anything but confident. As the wagon crested a small rise, Owen drew the horses to a stop. "There it is," he said, pointing toward a small valley below them. "Sullivan's place." Tessa followed his gaze. A small log cabin stood nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees that followed the curve of a creek. A dilapidated barn stood nearby, and what had once been a vegetable garden was now overgrown. It was humble, far humbler than anything she had imagined when she'd purchased her charming country property, but something about the peaceful setting with the mountains rising in the distance stirred an unexpected feeling in her chest. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Owen looked at her with surprise, then nodded. Sullivan thought so too. The wagon rattled down the slope toward the cabin. As they drew closer, Tessa could see the cabin's weathered logs and the porch that sagged slightly on one side. The place had clearly been abandoned for months. Owen pulled the wagon to a stop before the cabin and helped Tessa down. "Let me check inside first," he said, stepping onto the porch. The door creaked as he pushed it open, disappearing into the dim interior. Moments later he emerged, looking relieved. No critters have moved in. It's dusty but intact. He carried her trunk inside while Tessa gathered her courage to enter what might be her home, at least temporarily. When she stepped through the doorway, she found herself in a single room with a stone fireplace along one wall. A rough-hewn table stood in the center, 2 chairs beside it. A narrow bed occupied one corner and shelves lined another wall. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but the space was dry and sound. "It's not much," Owen said, setting her trunk down. "It's more than I expected to have an hour ago," Tessa replied honestly. Owen nodded, then moved to the fireplace, kneeling to arrange kindling and logs from a stack beside the hearth. "Nights get cold even in spring," he explained as he worked. "You'll want a fire." Once the flames were crackling steadily, he straightened. "I should be going. I've got livestock to tend to." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and placed several objects on the table. "Matches and the key to the cabin. There's a well out back for water." "Thank you, Mr. Xavier." "Your kindness is greatly appreciated." Owen shifted uncomfortably at her thanks. "I'll stop by tomorrow, bring you some supplies." "That's not necessary, with respect, Miss O'Malley, it is. You've got no food and town's 5 miles away." He moved toward the door, then paused. Sullivan kept a shotgun above the door frame. It's still loaded. He reached up and carefully removed an old but well-maintained shotgun from a rack Tessa hadn't noticed. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Tessa eyed the weapon warily. "I'm afraid not." Owen nodded as if he'd expected as much. "I'll show you tomorrow. For tonight, just the sight of it should discourage any unwanted visitors, though we don't get many troubles out here." He placed the gun on the table. "Bar the door after I leave. I'll knock 3 times when I come in the morning." With that, he tipped his hat and was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Tessa listened to the creak of the wagon and the soft commands he gave his horses as they pulled away. When the sounds had faded, she was left with only the crackling of the fire and the profound silence of the desert night. She moved to the small window and looked out at the darkening landscape. Boston seemed a lifetime away. Everyone and everything she had ever known was gone. Her parents. Her home. Her modest but comfortable life. Now she was alone in a rough cabin in a territory she knew nothing about, with only the vague promise of help from a taciturn rancher she'd just met. "Welcome home," she whispered to herself, repeating Owen's words with a mixture of irony and determination. Then, remembering his instructions, she moved to bar the door. Dawn arrived with a chorus of unfamiliar bird calls that penetrated the cabin's thin walls. Tessa had slept fitfully on the narrow bed, using her folded shawl as a pillow, too exhausted to unpack her trunk but too anxious to sleep deeply. She rose and splashed water on her face from the small basin she'd filled the night before, then changed into a fresh dress, her second best, saved for the occasion of meeting the land agent. The memory of Jenkins' deception made her stomach tighten. What would she do now? Her funds were nearly depleted after the journey west. Returning east was impossible, and she had no family or connections to fall back on. She'd have to find work, but what kind of employment could a genteel Boston lady find in a frontier town? 3 firm knocks on the door interrupted her troubled thoughts. She moved quickly to remove the bar, surprised to find Owen on her porch accompanied by a woman perhaps 10 years her senior. "Morning, Miss O'Malley," Owen said, hat already in his hands. "This is my sister, Olivia Xavier Bennett. Thought you might appreciate some female company." Olivia was tall like her brother, with the same auburn-streaked hair pulled back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. Her calico dress was simple but well-made, and her smile was warm as she extended a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I've brought breakfast," she announced, stepping into the cabin without waiting for an invitation, "and some basic supplies to tide you over. Owen told me about your situation." She set the basket on the table and turned to look at Tessa, her gaze appraising but not unkind. You poor thing, coming all this way to be swindled by that snake Jenkins. Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Bennet, Tessa said, feeling strangely self-conscious about the cabin's dusty state, though it was hardly her fault. Oh, please call me Olivia, we don't stand on ceremony much out here. She began unpacking the basket, revealing biscuits, a jar of preserves, hard-boiled eggs, and a small pot of coffee still steaming. Sit, eat. You look half-starved from your journey. Owen had remained by the door, looking awkward amidst this feminine exchange. I'll check the well pump and see to the barn, he muttered and disappeared outside. Olivia watched him go with a knowing smile. My brother's not much for chit-chat, but he's a good man, one of the best. She continued unpacking the basket, revealing soap, candles, and a small sack of flour. I've included some basic provisions. Owen says you might stay here while you decide what to do next. Tessa sat down at the table, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. I'm not sure what my options are, she admitted as she accepted a plate from Olivia. I spent nearly everything I had on the deed and the journey west. Olivia sat across from her, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. Well, you could try to find work in town, though jobs for ladies are limited. There's the schoolhouse, but they've already got a teacher. Mrs. Finch might need help at the boarding house. The saloon always needs girls, but she stopped abruptly. I don't mean to suggest, of course not, Tessa said quickly, understanding the unspoken implication. I was a companion to an elderly lady in Boston before her passing, and I've done some seamstress work. Perhaps there's need for such services here, Olivia considered this. Possibly. Most women do their own sewing, but for finer work or special occasions, it could be an option. She took a sip of her coffee. There's another possibility, though Owen would have my head if he knew I was suggesting it. Tessa raised an eyebrow questioningly. This property, Olivia continued, gesturing around them. As Owen probably told you, the county's trying to determine ownership since Sullivan died without heirs. But possession counts for a lot out here, especially with the territorial authorities overwhelmed and understaffed. You're suggesting I simply claim the property as my own. Olivia shrugged. You have a deed, even if Jenkins had no right to sell it to you. It's a starting point. If you improve the property, live on it for a time, you might establish a valid claim. Homesteading laws are still being sorted out in the territory, but squatters' rights hold weight. Tessa considered the idea. It was morally questionable, yet she had purchased the property in good faith. Even if I could establish a legal claim, I know nothing about ranching or farming. That's where neighbors come in, Olivia said with a smile. Owen's ranch borders this one. He already helps half the small ranchers in the area when they need it. The door opened, and Owen stepped back inside, dusting his hands on his pants. Pump needed priming, but it's working fine now. Barn structurally sound, though it needs new roofing in spots. His practical assessment brought Tessa back to the immediate challenges. Thank you, Mr. Xavier. You and your sister have been extraordinarily kind to a stranger. Owen, he corrected, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. Mr. Xavier was my father. He glanced at his sister. Livy, I told Frank I'd meet him at noon to help with that broken fence line. Olivia nodded, understanding his unspoken request. I should get back as well. My husband will be wondering where I've gotten to. She rose from the table. Miss O'Malley, Tessa, please. Tessa then. I live just 3 miles east of here with my husband, Daniel. You're welcome to visit any time. She gathered her empty basket. And you're welcome to keep the dishes until you can get your own in town. After she'd gone, Owen lingered, looking around the cabin with a critical eye. Place needs a good cleaning, but it's solid. Sullivan built it to last. He moved to the table where the shotgun still lay. If you're staying, you should learn to use this. I haven't decided if I'm staying, Tessa said, though something inside her was warming to the idea. This little cabin, humble as it was, represented a fresh start, a place where she might forge her own path. Owen picked up the shotgun. Either way, knowing how to protect yourself isn't a bad idea. Come on. He led her outside to a clearing beside the cabin. The morning was warm already. the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch forever. Owen positioned several empty cans on a fallen log about 20 yards away, then returned to where Tessa waited anxiously. "First rule, always treat it as if it's loaded," he said, checking the chambers though he knew the gun was ready to fire. "Second rule, never point it at anything you don't intend to shoot." Tessa listened intently as he explained the basic mechanics of the weapon, how to hold it properly against her shoulder, how to aim along the barrel, and finally, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. "You want to try?" he asked when he'd finished his explanation. Tessa hesitated, then nodded. Owen handed her the shotgun, helping her position it correctly against her shoulder. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the light pressure of his hands as he adjusted her stance. "Keep both eyes open," he advised, his voice close to her ear. "Sight down the barrel at that middle can. When you're ready, squeeze gently." Tessa drew a deep breath, aimed as best she could, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was stronger than she'd anticipated, knocking her slightly off balance. The shot went wide, missing the cans entirely and sending a small cloud of dust up from the ground beyond. "That's all right," Owen said, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "Nobody hits their target first try. Let's reload and you can try again." They spent the next hour practicing, Owen patiently reloading and offering advice. By the end, Tessa had managed to hit 2 of the cans, and the sense of accomplishment made her cheeks flush with pride. "Not bad," Owen said as they walked back to the cabin. "You're a quick learner." "Thank you for teaching me," Tessa replied, finding that the weight of the shotgun felt less alien in her hands now. Back at the cabin, Owen placed the weapon in its rack above the door. "I need to head out now, but I'll stop by tomorrow to see how you're getting on." He hesitated, then added, "There's a small vegetable garden behind the cabin. It's overgrown, but the soil's good. Sullivan used to grow tomatoes, beans, squash." The thought of coaxing food from the earth appealed to Tessa. In Boston, she tended a few potted herbs on her windowsill, finding solace in nurturing the small plants. "I'll look at it," she promised. Owen nodded, seeming pleased by her response. "Town's got a general store. Parker, the owner, is fair. You can get seeds and basic tools there." "I'll keep that in mind when I visit town," Tessa said, though she wasn't sure when that might be, given the 5-mile distance. Owen seemed to read her thoughts. "I'm heading to town on Saturday for supplies. You're welcome to ride along if you need anything." "That's very kind." "I would appreciate that." An awkward silence fell between them. Owen shifted his weight, then finally said, "Well, I best be going. Bar the door at night, and if you need anything urgent, my place is just over that rise to the west." He pointed through the window. "Follow the creek upstream about a mile. You can't miss it." With that, he tipped his hat and was gone, leaving Tessa alone with the vast silence of her new surroundings. The next few days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Tessa spent the first day thoroughly cleaning the cabin, removing layers of dust and grime, washing the windows to let in more light, and organizing the few possessions Sullivan had left behind, mainly tools, cooking implements, and a small collection of dog-eared books that she examined with interest in the evenings. She explored the property, discovering the overgrown vegetable garden Owen had mentioned, a small orchard with apple and pear trees that would bear fruit later in the year, and the creek with its clear, cool water. Each day, she ventured a little farther, gaining confidence in navigating her new surroundings. Owen kept his word, stopping by each day to check on her. His visits were brief and practical, showing her how to properly stack firewood, explaining which wild plants were edible and which to avoid, helping her patch a leak in the cabin roof. But Tessa found herself looking forward to these interactions, to the quiet competence he displayed, and the occasional glimpses of dry humor that softened his typically serious demeanor. On her third day at the cabin, Tessa had been working in the garden, clearing weeds and turning the soil in preparation for planting, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. Owen rode into view on a tall bay gelding, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze down her face. "Afternoon, Miss O'Malley," he called, dismounting smoothly. Tessa set aside her hoe and wiped her brow with the back of her hand. She was wearing her oldest dress, its hem already stained with the red Arizona soil, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. "Mr. Xavier," she acknowledged, wondering about the second horse. "Thought you might need transportation," he said, gesturing to the mare. "This is Daisy. She belonged to Sullivan, but I've been keeping her at my place since he passed. She's yours if you want her." Tessa approached cautiously. She had ridden occasionally in Boston, proper side-saddle excursions in the park, but nothing like the kind of riding required in this rugged country. "I'm not sure I can accept such a generous gift," she said, though she reached out to stroke the mare's soft nose. "Not a gift," Owen clarified. "Sullivan would have wanted her to be useful, and you need a way to get around." He paused. "You do know how to ride, a little," Tessa admitted. "Though I suspect riding here is quite different from what I'm accustomed to." A smile tugged at the corner of Owen's mouth. "I reckon it is." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Got you something else, too." Tessa accepted the package, unwrapping it to find a pair of riding pants, practical, sturdy canvas trousers like those worn by men. "I know it's not proper Boston fashion," Owen said quickly, noting her surprise. "But out here, practical trumps proper when it comes to riding. Olivia wears similar when she's working with horses." Tessa ran her fingers over the rough fabric, considering. In Boston, a lady wearing trousers would cause an absolute scandal. But this wasn't Boston, and as Owen said, practical concerns outweighed social niceties in this harsh landscape. "Thank you," she said simply. "They'll be most useful." Relief flickered across Owen's face. "Good, thought I might have offended you." "It would take more than practical clothing to offend me, Mr. Xavier." She folded the trousers carefully. "Though I'm not sure how quickly I'll master riding Western style." "I could teach you," he offered, the words coming out in a rush as if he hadn't intended to say them. "I mean, if you'd like, just the basics." Tessa found herself smiling at his awkwardness. "I would appreciate that very much." And so another element was added to their daily routine. Each afternoon, Owen would arrive and they would spend an hour with the horses. He taught her to saddle Daisy properly, to mount and dismount without assistance, and to guide the horse using pressure from her knees and subtle shifts in the reins rather than the formal commands she had learned in Boston. At first, Tessa wore her dress for these lessons, but after nearly catching her skirts on the saddle horn and almost falling, she reluctantly tried the riding pants. The freedom of movement was revelatory, allowing her to sit astride properly and control Daisy with much greater ease. If Owen noticed the change in her appearance, he made no comment beyond a practical nod of approval at her improved riding posture. Saturday arrived, and with it, the promised trip to town. Tessa dressed in her best remaining dress, a practical navy blue with modest white trim, and secured her hair neatly beneath a small hat. When Owen arrived with his wagon, she was waiting on the porch, a small list of necessities clutched in her gloved hand. "You look nice," Owen said as he helped her into the wagon, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. "Thank you," Tessa replied, feeling a flush creep up her neck that had nothing to do with the warm spring morning. The ride to town was pleasant, the landscape unfolding around them in rugged beauty. Owen pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, the distant mountains, the junction where the creek that ran through her property joined a larger river. Tessa found herself drawn to his quiet enthusiasm for this harsh but beautiful country. "Have you lived here long?" she asked as they crested a rise that offered a view all the way to the scattered buildings of Cottonwood Springs. "Born and raised," Owen replied. "My father established the ranch 30 years ago when this was still part of New Mexico territory, raised cattle, horses, a few crops." His expression softened with memory. "He and my mother built something good here, though it wasn't easy." "And now it's yours," Tessa observed. Owen nodded. Pa died 5 years back. Ma followed a year later. Livy was already married to Daniel by then, so the ranch came to me. He glanced at her. What about your family? You mentioned Boston. My parents died last winter, Tessa said, the words still catching in her throat though the sharp edge of grief had dulled. Influenza. It took them both within a week of each other. I'm sorry, Owen said quietly. Thank you. We weren't wealthy but comfortable enough. My father was a bookkeeper for a shipping company. My mother gave piano lessons. She looked down at her gloved hands. After they were gone, the house seemed so empty. When I saw the advertisement for a property out west, it seemed like a chance to start fresh, somewhere the memories weren't so painful. Owen was silent for a long moment, and then Jenkins swindled you? Yes, Tessa agreed, though perhaps not entirely. I may not have the property I thought I purchased, but I do have a new beginning. Their conversation lapsed into companionable silence as they approached town. Cottonwood Springs looked different in the full light of day than it had in the fading light of Tessa's arrival. The buildings, though weathered, showed signs of a growing community. Fresh paint on the church, a new addition being constructed on the general store, children playing in a schoolyard. Owen guided the wagon to a stop outside the general store. Parker's got most everything you'll need, he said as he helped her down. I've got business at the livery and with Sheriff Donovan. Meet back here in 2 hours. Tessa nodded, suddenly nervous at the prospect of navigating the town alone. As if sensing her apprehension, Owen added, Parker's wife, Mary, is good people. Tell her you're staying at Sullivan's place. She'll look after you. With that reassurance, Tessa entered the general store. The interior was cool and dim after the bright sunshine outside, shelves stocked with a surprising variety of goods. A bell above the door announced her arrival, and a plump, pleasant-faced woman looked up from behind the counter. Good morning, she called cheerfully. You must be the lady staying out at Sullivan's place. Owen mentioned you'd be coming in. Yes, I'm Tessa O'Malley, Tessa replied, momentarily taken aback that news of her arrival had already circulated. Mary Parker, the woman introduced herself, coming around the counter to shake Tessa's hand firmly. Welcome to Cottonwood Springs. Terrible business with Jenkins. The sheriff's got a warrant out for him, but he's likely halfway to California by now. So I understand, Tessa said. I was hoping to purchase some supplies. She held out her list. Mary scanned it with practiced efficiency. Basic staples, garden seeds, all easily done, and may I suggest a few other items a lady might need, she leaned in conspiratorially. We've just received a shipment of proper soap lavender scented, not that lye stuff the men use, and some decent hairpins that won't rust in our climate. Tessa found herself warming to Mary's friendly manner as they moved through the store, gathering items from her list and adding a few of Mary's suggestions. As they worked, Mary introduced her to other customers who entered the store: the blacksmith's wife, the elderly woman who served as the town's midwife, the young mother with twins who ran the post office with her husband. Each greeted Tessa with varying degrees of curiosity and warmth, but none with outright hostility. By the time she had completed her purchases, Tessa felt she had a better understanding of the community she had inadvertently joined. How are you settling in out at Sullivan's place? Mary asked as she tallied Tessa's purchases. It's been an adjustment, Tessa admitted, but the cabin is sound and the land is beautiful. Mary nodded approvingly. Tom kept that place nice despite his age. Of course, Owen helped him a great deal in those last years. Mr. Xavier has been very kind, Tessa agreed. Something knowing flickered in Mary's eyes. Owen's a good man, keeps to himself mostly since his parents passed, works too hard if you ask most folks around here. She wrapped Tessa's purchases in brown paper. It's good to see him taking an interest in something besides that ranch of his. Before Tessa could formulate a response to this statement with its subtle implication, the store bell rang again. She turned to find Owen in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Finished earlier than expected, he explained. Sheriff wasn't in his office. "We're all done here," Mary announced, handing Tessa her packages. "You come back soon, Miss O'Malley. It's good to have another civilized lady in these parts." Outside, Owen loaded Tessa's purchases into the wagon. "Get everything you need?" he asked. "Yes, and more," Tessa replied. "Mrs. Parker was very helpful." "Mary's got opinions on what everybody needs," Owen said with a hint of amusement. "Hope she didn't talk your ear off, not at all. She introduced me to several townspeople." Tessa hesitated, then added, "Everyone seems to know I'm staying at the Sullivan place." Owen helped her into the wagon before replying. "Small towns news travels fast. Does it bother you?" "No," Tessa said after consideration, "though I wonder what they think of my situation." Owen climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Folks around here mind their own business mostly, and they don't take kindly to swindlers like Jenkins." He glanced at her. "Nobody thinks poorly of you if that's what you're worried about." His matter-of-fact assurance was comforting. As they pulled away from town, Tessa realized that for the first time since arriving in Arizona territory, she felt something like belonging beginning to take root. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that became increasingly comfortable. Tessa worked diligently on the cabin and garden, transforming both through sheer determination. The cabin's interior was scrubbed clean, its sparse furnishings arranged to maximize the small space. Curtains made from fabric purchased in town softened the windows, and wild flowers in a jar brightened the table. In the garden, the soil proved as fertile as Owen had promised. Tessa planted seeds according to the advice of Mary Parker and Olivia, who visited regularly, bringing practical gifts, kitchen implements, preserved foods, and once, a kitten from her barn cat's recent litter to control the mice in the cabin. Tessa named the orange tabby Penny, for the copper color of her fur, and found unexpected comfort in the small creature's companionship during the quiet evenings. The kitten slept curled at her feet and purred enthusiastically whenever Tessa returned from working outdoors. Owen's daily visits continued, though their purpose grew less clearly defined. He still offered practical assistance mending the barn roof, helping her clear a section of pasture, teaching her to use Sullivan's old tools, but they also spent time simply talking, getting to know each other in the measured way of two cautious souls. Tessa learned that Owen had attended 2 years of university in Denver before his father's failing health called him home to the ranch. He loved literature and often brought books from his own collection to loan her, their discussions of the stories extending into the long summer evenings as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the desert in breathtaking colors. For his part, Owen discovered that beneath Tessa's proper Boston exterior lay a woman of remarkable resilience and surprising humor. He found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced to anyone, about his dreams for the ranch, his occasional loneliness, his love for this harsh but beautiful territory. By mid-June, when the garden was flourishing and the first vegetables were ready for harvest, their relationship had evolved into a friendship neither had anticipated but both treasured. Yet beneath the friendship, an undercurrent of something deeper was developing, evident in the way Owen's hand lingered when he helped her down from Daisy after a riding lesson, or how Tessa found herself watching the sunset not for its beauty, but for the way it gilded Owen's profile as he sat beside her. Neither spoke of this growing attraction, though Olivia observed it with poorly concealed delight during her visits, often making excuses to leave early when Owen arrived. "You two have plenty to discuss without me underfoot," she would say with a knowing smile that made Tessa blush. The question of Tessa's legal right to the property remained unresolved. Sheriff Donovan had sent inquiries about Sullivan's possible heirs to territorial officials, but the bureaucratic wheels turned slowly. In the meantime, Tessa's improvements to the property strengthened her claim, according to Olivia's husband, Daniel, who had some knowledge of territorial law from his work as the town's part-time justice of the peace. "Possession and improvement count for a lot," he assured her during a Sunday dinner at their home. Especially with no other claimants coming forward, July brought intense heat that shimmered across the landscape. The garden required daily watering, a task Tessa undertook in the early morning and late evening to avoid the worst of the sun. Owen brought her a wide-brimmed straw hat to protect her from the relentless glare, his concern for her fair skin touching her deeply. "Your nose is already peeling," he said gruffly as he presented the hat. "Can't have you looking like an old saddle by August." Tessa laughed and accepted the gift, placing it on her head. "How do I look? Like a proper Arizona rancher?" The question was meant to be light-hearted, but Owen's expression turned serious as he studied her. She had changed in the months since her arrival. Her skin was sun-kissed despite her precautions, her hands slightly roughened by work, her posture more relaxed. The prim Boston lady was still evident in her speech and manners, but she moved through this rugged landscape with increasing confidence. "You look like you belong here," he said finally, his voice low. The words warmed her more than the summer sun. She did feel a sense of belonging that had been absent in Boston after her parents' deaths. This small cabin, this patch of land, had become home in a way she hadn't expected. That evening, as they sat on the porch enjoying a slight breeze that offered relief from the day's heat, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted their conversation about the book Owen had most recently loaned her. "Storm coming," he observed, scanning the horizon where clouds were building, dark and ominous against the setting sun. "First big one of the summer by the look of it." Tessa followed his gaze with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Desert storms, she had learned, could be spectacular and terrifying in their intensity. "Will the garden be all right?" she asked. "Should be, unless we get hail." Owen rose from his chair. "I should head back before it hits, make sure everything's secured at the ranch." Tessa felt a pang of disappointment at his early departure but understood the necessity. "Of course, thank you for the book." Owen hesitated at the porch steps, looking back at her. "Bar the doors if it gets bad. These summer storms can bring high winds." Another pause, then he added, "I could come back after I've checked the ranch. Make sure you're all right." The offer hung between them, weighted with more than concern about the weather. In the month since her arrival, Owen had never stayed past sunset, mindful of propriety despite the unconventional nature of their friendship. "I would welcome the company," Tessa said carefully, "if it's not too much trouble." Owen nodded, seemingly relieved by her response. "I'll be back before the worst hits," he promised, then strode to his horse and mounted in one fluid motion that Tessa still admired despite her own improved riding skills. She watched him ride away, then turned her attention to securing the cabin and barn. The animals needed to be settled. Daisy in her stall, the half-dozen chickens Owen had given her in their coop, and the new calf, a gift from Olivia and Daniel, in the small pen adjoining the barn. By the time she had finished these tasks, the wind had picked up considerably, bending the cottonwood trees along the creek and sending dust devils spinning across the yard. The thunder was closer now, accompanied by flashes of lightning that illuminated the rapidly darkening sky. Inside the cabin, Tessa lit lamps and stoked the small fire she kept burning despite the summer heat, for cooking and comfort rather than warmth. Penny watched from her perch on the bed as Tessa moved about the familiar space, securing shutters and checking that everything was properly stored in case the wind found its way inside. The first fat drops of rain were just beginning to fall when the sound of hoofbeats announced Owen's return. Tessa opened the door to find him dismounting quickly, his horse's flanks already wet with rain. "Just in time," she called over the rising wind. "I'll make coffee while you see to your horse." Owen nodded, leading the animal toward the barn. Tessa returned to the cabin, setting water to boil on the small stove and taking 2 cups from the shelf. Her heart was beating faster than the situation warranted, a reaction she attributed to the approaching storm rather than Owen's presence. He returned minutes later, removing his hat and slicker just inside the door. "It's coming down hard now," he reported, running a hand through his hair, which curled damply at his temples. Creek will rise, but the cabin's high enough to stay dry. Good to know, Tessa replied, pouring coffee into the waiting cups. I wasn't sure what to expect from a real desert thunderstorm. They can be powerful, Owen said, accepting the cup she offered, but usually pass quickly. This one looks to have some staying power, though. As if to confirm his assessment, a crack of thunder shook the cabin, so loud that Tessa jumped, nearly spilling her coffee. Penny darted under the bed with a startled yowl. Sorry, Tessa said, embarrassed by her reaction. I'm not used to storms of this magnitude. Owen's expression was gentle. Nothing to apologize for. Nature's got a way of reminding us how small we are out here. They sat at the table, sipping their coffee as the storm intensified around the cabin. Rain lashed the windows, and wind found every crack and crevice, causing the flame in the oil lamp to flicker. The thunder and lightning seemed to surround them, the storm directly overhead now. Their conversation was sporadic, interrupted by particularly loud thunderclaps or dramatic flashes of lightning that momentarily turned night to day. Tessa found herself grateful for Owen's steady presence, his calm in the face of nature's fury reassuring. Tell me about Boston, Owen said during a brief lull in the storm's intensity. Do you miss it? Tessa considered the question seriously. I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the concerts, the bustle of a big city, but it stopped feeling like home after my parents died. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger. I miss them more than the place. Owen nodded in understanding. I felt that way when my parents passed. The ranch seemed too quiet, too empty without Ma's singing and Pa's booming voice. He looked around the cabin. Sullivan said something similar after his wife died, said the silence was the hardest part. Yes, Tessa agreed softly, the silence. Their eyes met across the table, a moment of perfect comprehension passing between them. Both knew the particular loneliness that came with grief, the empty spaces left by those who could never be replaced. A tremendous crack of thunder broke the moment, followed immediately by a blinding flash of lightning. The cabin shuddered, and the lamp flickered out, plunging them into darkness save for the dim glow from the stove. Tessa gasped involuntarily, her hand reaching out across the table. Owen's fingers found hers, warm and reassuring in the sudden darkness. Just the lamp, he said, his voice steady. I'll relight it. He rose, still holding her hand, then seemed to realize and gently released it. Tessa heard him moving in the darkness, then the scratch of a match. Light bloomed as he lit the lamp, his face illuminated from below, shadows playing across his features. Thank you, Tessa said, feeling oddly breathless. Owen returned to his seat, the small flame between them casting a warm glow that created an intimate circle in the storm-lashed cabin. Outside, the rain continued to fall in sheets, drumming on the roof with hypnotic intensity. It's a good sound, Owen observed, tilting his head to listen. Rain on a roof means life for everything growing. Your garden will be happy, Tessa agreed, then corrected herself. Our gardens. Yours and mine. Something shifted in Owen's expression at her words, a softening around his eyes. Tessa, he began, then stopped, seeming to search for words that eluded him. The use of her given name, rare despite their growing closeness, made her heart skip. Yes. Owen looked down at his hands, then back at her, resolution settling over his features. I've been meaning to speak with you about something. About the property? Tessa felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Was he about to tell her that Sullivan's heir had been found? That she would have to leave the home she had come to love? What about it? She asked, struggling to keep her voice even. I received a letter from the Territorial Land Office yesterday, Owen said, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. They've reviewed the case and determined that in the absence of any blood relatives coming forward, Sullivan's property should be offered for public auction. The weight in Tessa's stomach turned to stone. I see, she managed. When would this auction take place? Next month, most likely. Owen leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Tessa, I want you to know that whatever happens, you won't be left without options. She tried to smile, though her lips trembled with the effort. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't expect marry me." The words hung in the air between them, as startling as the lightning that continued to flash outside. Tessa stared at Owen, certain she had misheard. "What did you say?" she whispered. Owen's expression was earnest, his eyes steady on hers. "Marry me, Tessa. We could combine our properties, work them together. You wouldn't have to leave your home." Tessa's mind raced. Was this a proposal of convenience, a practical solution to her predicament? The thought that Owen might offer marriage without love, out of pity or a sense of obligation, was painful. "Is that the only reason?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. "To secure my claim to the property?" Owen's face fell, and he reached across the table to take her hands in his. "No," he said firmly. "That's not why, though I admit it's what made me speak now rather than later." His fingers tightened around hers. "I've been falling in love with you since the day you arrived, looking so lost but determined on that dusty street. I love your courage, your kindness, the way you've made this harsh place bloom. I love watching you with Penny and Daisy and the garden. I love our conversations and the sound of your laughter." He took a deep breath, his voice growing rougher with emotion. "I didn't plan to speak so soon. I wanted to court you properly, give you time to be sure of your feelings, but with the auction looming, I couldn't bear the thought of you leaving." Tears filled Tessa's eyes, blurring the beloved face across from her. "Oh, Owen," she whispered. "I've been falling in love with you too, with your quiet strength and your generosity, with the way you love this land and the people on it." Relief and joy transformed Owen's expression. He rose, still holding her hands, drawing her to her feet and around the table until they stood face to face in the small circle of lamplight, the storm forgotten. "I can't offer you Boston or concerts or libraries," he said softly. "Just a life here, building something together." "That's all I want," Tessa replied, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain all she was feeling. "A home, with you." Owen's hand trembled slightly as he touched her cheek. "May I kiss you, Miss O'Malley?" he asked, a hint of his familiar formality returning even as his eyes darkened with emotion. "Yes, Mr. Xavier," she answered with a smile that dissolved as his lips met hers, gentle at first, then with increasing certainty. Outside, the storm began to abate, the thunder more distant, the rain softening to a steady patter. Inside the small cabin, Tessa and Owen scarcely noticed, lost in the discovery of each other and the promise of a shared future. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Cottonwood Springs. The entire town turned out for the occasion, curious to witness the union of the reserved rancher and the Boston lady who had arrived with no one to greet her just months before. Tessa wore a simple white dress that Mary Parker had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Owen stood tall and proud in a new black suit, his usually tanned face slightly pale with nerves until Tessa appeared in the church doorway, at which point his expression transformed into one of such naked adoration that several of the older women in attendance dabbed at their eyes. Olivia stood as Tessa's witness, beaming with satisfaction at the match she had subtly encouraged from the beginning. Daniel, as justice of the peace, performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure, his booming voice filling the small church as he pronounced them husband and wife. The celebration afterward, held in the town square under cottonwood trees strung with lanterns, lasted well into the night. Tessa danced with her new husband under the stars, surrounded by people who had become friends in a place that had become home. When they finally departed, amid cheers and well wishes, it was to Owen's ranch house, larger than Sullivan's cabin but built with the same solid craftsmanship. Tessa would maintain her garden at the cabin, and they would use the barn and pastures for the expanding herd of cattle and horses they planned to raise together. The territorial land auction had been rendered moot by their marriage and the subsequent consolidation of the properties. The official paperwork was still being processed, but no one doubted the outcome. In the territory, possession and improvement counted for much, and the combined Xavier Ranch was now one of the most promising in the county. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, Owen took Tessa's hand and pressed it to his lips. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier," he said softly. Tessa smiled, remembering the first time he had spoken those words to her, when she had been a stranger in a strange land, uncertain and alone. Now they held a different meaning, not just the promise of shelter, but of belonging, of shared purpose, of love. "I am home," she replied, drawing his face down to hers for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Years later, when their children asked how they met, Owen would always begin the story the same way. "She arrived with no one to greet her, so I tipped my hat and said, 'Welcome home.'" And Tessa would smile, knowing that in those simple words lay the beginning of everything that mattered. Their ranch prospered through the years, weathering drought and harsh winters, economic downturns, and the gradual changes that came to the territory as Arizona moved toward statehood. They raised 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, in a home filled with books, music, for Tessa had eventually acquired a piano, and love. Tessa's garden expanded to include flowers as well as vegetables, transforming the desert around their home into an oasis that visitors marveled at. Owen's cattle and horses became known throughout the territory for their quality, and their combined determination and hard work built a legacy that would sustain generations to come. But in quiet moments, when they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, their hands would find each other, and they would remember that first storm-swept night when they had discovered that home wasn't a place at all, but the love they had found in each other.